A lot of people are salivating, I suppose might be the word, at the prospect of seeing the Epstein client lists or the Diddy tapes. Do you think those will see the light of day in any meaningful way?
What's happened over the last 8 years is that there have been a lot of investigations where the main obstacles have been government officials. Doing something like a government-scale Twitter files would win hearts and minds at a level that would be tough for anybody to compete with. Everywhere else in the world, the kind of official censorship movement is already in full swing.
To me, something crystallised with the Hunter Biden pardon. They seem to be being told, well, the rule of law applies when we say it applies, and it applies differently to you than it applies to us.
That's just sort of openly admitting to even your own voters. We'll lie when it suits us, or when we say things, you can expect that we're saying them for political reasons, and also to cut off access to that information that might make them less trustful.
So thanks for joining me today, Matt Taibbi, investigative journalist. I've been very impressed by the work that you've been doing over the years. In particular, recently I watched your speech at the Rescue the Republic event in Washington. I very much enjoyed it for all sorts of reasons. Yeah. I suppose I would kick off by asking, is the Republic closer to rescue now since the last election or not?
I hope so. I think we may have gotten a reprieve for a little while. I grew up kind of a political liberal, a lifelong Democrat, always voted Democrat for the presidency especially, and but in the last 2-3 years, I've spent a lot of time on this digital censorship issue, and it was abundantly clear to me that if this current administration stayed in office, that we were going to move to something like the European Digital Services Act, or what you're dealing with over there in the UK, and that is so different from the American tradition that I thought that was sort of an emergency, and I think we at least have a pause before we get there.
I'm determinedly optimistic. Apart from anything else, I almost feel as if in times like these, it's an obligation to be optimistic,
sure,
and to wait and see what actually happens. But is it too early to read what signals there are coming from the proposed Donald Trump administration in terms of appointees? And so is it too early to judge what that means? Or if it isn't, how are you reading it, and what signals do you pick up from who's been proposed so far?
I don't think it's too early at all. I think he's sending, I think there's a lot of intentionality in the signaling of these choices. Just to take an example, the choice of Jay Bhattacharya to lead the National Institutes of Health. Now, Jay is probably most famous in America, not just as a kind of dissident on some COVID issues, but also as a censored person. He was de-amplified on Twitter and in some other places, and he was the plaintiff in probably the biggest speech case that we had in the last 4 years, Missouri v. Biden, which became Murphy v. Missouri. Tulsi Gabbard being named to be the director of national intelligence, that's a pretty big hint that they're not really all that excited about the current surveillance state, because she's most famous recently for being placed under surveillance with air marshals following her. And Kash Patel, who is going to be theoretically the FBI director, is somebody who was universally despised by the American media for his views on the Russiagate investigation, where he turned out to be right, but it signals, I think, that they're going to continue to investigate the origins of that probe, which I think is good.
I absolutely hear you and concur. I think I am very drawn or very impressed by Robert Kennedy Jr. I think he's an extremely articulate speaker. He's a very impressive person to listen to, apart from anything else. And I've certainly agreed with the direction from which he's been coming for years, long before he was being mentioned in connection to running for president and so on and so on. And there are many.
By the way, and he's also among the most censored people in the country. So
without a doubt. So there are definitely, when you talk about intentionality, you look at those appointments that you just listed and you think, right, that does sound like putting together a team that could contemplate clearing the Augean stables or whatever. But then it seems to me that there's almost a multiple personality disorder going on, because you've also got Marco Rubio, you've got Seb Gorka, you've got Mick Huckabee, Pete Hegseth, who are people who, if they signal anything at all, well, it's fairly clear what they signal, and you think how do the different aspects of that personality that's coming together, how do they come from the same intentionality?
Well, Rubio, I think you have to look at the politics of that, because when at the beginning of the Republican convention, this is maybe a story that didn't get out as much as it should have in America, but the choice for vice president came down to two people. It was Marco Rubio or Vance, and the sort of national security establishment that's still left in the Republican Party, they were very heavily pushing Rubio. They wanted that very badly, and the Trump family and a few other people in his inner circle pushed for Vance. And it was a political decision that was based on the idea that we will not be taken seriously by the sort of populist side of the MAGA movement if we bring in somebody like Rubio as a running mate. So when they made the decision, and I think that was not an easy one for some of the people in the Republican Party, it made it inevitable that Rubio was going to get some kind of big job if they won the presidency. So I understand that pick. Rubio is up and down. There are things about him that I really don't like, but there are other things where I could say, there are a lot worse senators out there, I would say. And then, even Huckabee, I actually interviewed Huckabee pretty closely 8 years ago, or not even 8 years ago, 16 years ago. And he was originally famous for being one of the early Republicans to flirt with the idea that the party needed to move in a more sort of working class direction. And even though he didn't nail the formula, I think he has some instincts that aren't terrible. I mean, a lot of things I don't agree with him about, but I understand the choice.
One of the burgeoning issues that I've been most exercised about is Ukraine, and obviously, like many people who were interested in Trump, were drawn to the fact that he was talking about stopping the killing, ending the killing, seeking peace. Do you think that's still clearly being signalled? When you've got people like Waltz saying, there's no daylight between our approach and the approach of the present administration. You got Seb Gorka, going on screen to call Putin a thug. I don't think any of these things happen by accident. But what's the intentionality there? Well,
look, they understand. The Trump people, I think, do understand that their supporters are very much not interested in continuing to support that war effort. They either want it concluded one way or the other quickly. And you can see by the behaviors of all the different players in the war right now that everybody believes that, because the Russians have made a very costly advance in the last couple of months. And Ukrainians are upping the ante in their own way. I wouldn't even say the Ukrainians. NATO is upping the ante by sending missiles into Russian territory and trying to send a message. That's all, from what I understand, and by reading the Russian press, that's all because everybody expects that there will be talks almost immediately after the inauguration, and so there's a rush to grab as much territory as possible, so that they have more at the moment that those talks begin. There are people in Russia I know right now who are kind of communicating with the Russian government. I wouldn't say on behalf of the Trump administration, but sort of on the periphery of that. There are discussions. Nobody wants this thing to go on much longer, and the only thing that's left to hammer out is, what America is going to tolerate in terms of Ukraine's status going forward. Is that going to be? Are we actually going to try to get them something like NATO status, or not? Otherwise, I think the Russians are just happy with the territory they've gotten.
Do you think that I listen to people like Colonel Douglas Macgregor, and he talks persuasively about the world having changed significantly, and there's talk of multipolarity. The end of US hegemony. Other people that I listen to talk about, say that the US petrodollar is already dead. It just hasn't fallen down yet. That we're living in a different world. That the US is not even signalling that it's adapting to. Trump is saying that he'll sort of tariff his way out of US economic strife, as though that's going to stop BRICS in its tracks. It feels as though the US is still playing a non-existent game by the old rules, and you've got Russia and India and China and Brazil clearly looking to cooperate with one another, and possibly not needing America in the traditional way.
Right. Well, look, the subtext of the entire U.S. election was we had one party that was, I would say, excessively stressing the demands of empire over national rule, right? And then you had the other side, the Trump side, which is, sort of derisively termed nationalist, which really means, we would rather be spending money on hurricane relief in Tennessee than spending it on a war in Ukraine, right? That's what it comes down to. And the United States has gone so far into the direction of what they used to call benevolent hegemony, right? Like this whole idea that there was going to be unipolarity. Everybody's kind of fall in line with what we say. Anybody who falls out of line is a rogue nation. Like we've said that kind of openly over the course of the last 30 years. Those days I think are already over. It's just a question of when America recognizes that. It's a bitter pill for some people in Washington to swallow, to recognize that China and Russia and to a lesser extent India probably are already competing superpowers in a way, and we've had a hard time psychologically dealing with that, but I think it's a healthy thing for us to come to understand that and to spend more time sorting out our own problems and to deal with these other powers in a rational way.
And when you've got Trump talking about tariffs here, there, and everywhere, is that indicative of moving in the direction of coming to terms with the new multipolar reality or not?
I think, well, look, what that signals is we're more interested in our national concerns than our international concerns. I mean, we sort of got off the path, I think, my personal opinion, is that America took a big step away from its sort of traditional conception of itself when we signed NAFTA for the first time in the 90s. And then when we gave China most favored nation trading status, and then there was a whole host of these sort of international bureaucracies that became, if not more important, then close to as important as the American government. And the ordinary American voter, I think, was frustrated at the lack of influence they had over things that were, had an impact on their life, like, whether or not they were going to have manufacturing jobs anymore, or what the prices of agricultural products were, or whether some committee in Switzerland was going to decide what the lending limits were for banks. Like stuff like that. It was very frustrating for Americans. And so what the Trump administration, they at least ran against that movement away from kind of national concern. The tariffs, look, I'm not. I think what that's mostly about is, they're using that as a club to try to influence some other things like immigration. Maybe some, in the case of China, there are some other issues with like trademark infringement or currency manipulation. And, Trump's he's threatening a trade war, but he won't really go there, I don't think. His pattern is to talk big and then kind of back off in the end.
I spoke to Ed Dowd recently, BlackRock portfolio manager, as was now a truther, another campaigner on I suppose I would say on our side of the dividing line, and he was saying that for him a key indicator about the intention or not just the intention, but the reality of the incoming administration would be whether or not the administration does away with, or at least significantly suspends the use of the mRNA platform.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that with all the information that's out there now, with all the frightening data that's out there now, if they keep going with mRNA, that'll be a deal breaker for him. I wonder, are there any deal breakers for you, or are there any things that you need to see happen quite soon after January that will signal to you one way or the other whether you've backed a winning horse?
Well, on the speech front, if for instance, there is a body in the State Department called the Global Engagement Center that was created under Barack Obama. It's basically a kind of a domestic content moderation platform where they're reviewing things. It's set to expire and go out of business this year. If it doesn't, and under Marco Rubio it becomes a sort of reinvigorated body, that's going to make me nervous. But I think the biggest indicator will be what happens with the FBI. Kash Patel's come in, and he's made some very specific statements about doing things like moving the headquarters of the FBI. Now, this is something I heard about long before even Donald Trump came on the scene. I heard from FBI agents there's this huge dichotomy between the political end of the Bureau, which was moving in this direction of a kind of national domestic surveillance police, and away from making cases and fighting crime. If they don't do that, if they don't decentralize the FBI, if they don't cut off the top leadership level the way they've promised to do, then that will be a big indicator that something is very seriously wrong. I think there are a lot of things like that where they've made promises to kind of do away with a lot of especially the sort of internal-facing surveillance and policing mechanisms within the government that have gotten completely out of control. Those are the things that I'm most concerned about. And if they don't do anything about that, I think that'll... Also, by the way, the investigations into COVID, into Russiagate, into some other things that happen, I think they have to go on, not for punishment's sake, but just so people can have peace of mind about what happened.
A lot of people are very salivating, I suppose might be the word, at the prospect of seeing the Epstein client list, so-called, or the Diddy tapes, the Sean Combs tapes. Do you think those will see the light of day in any meaningful way?
I don't know. I mean, what I was told, I wasn't told anything about those tapes or those items, but what I was told is that you can expect there to be a lot of releases about a lot of really interesting things. And what's happened over the last 8 years is that there have been a lot of investigations that where the main obstacles have been government officials who have either refused to provide information or who haven't turned over unredacted documents. And so now that Donald Trump is in there, and let's be real, he wasn't really in charge of his own FBI and CIA back when he was president before. And if you need evidence of that, I can get into that. But now they understand that they have to be. And there's a lot of stuff that they can release and to make their case that they're on the people's side. And look, it's an easy political hit. Donald Trump, above all, is a political creature. And doing something like a government scale Twitter files would sort of win hearts and minds at a level that would be tough for anybody to compete with.
It was over the last 4 years, amongst the many things that have been eye-opening for me, was, I suppose, the realization. I think somebody described it as governments, administrations, regimes, whatever. It is the deep state that is all that matters, and that the politicians are just like the summer tenants that
right.
come and briefly occupy the chalets, and then they move on and they take their luggage with them. But what stays behind, is the staff that runs the joint. And unless and until, amongst other things, but unless and until somebody came in and fired all the dodgy staff, it doesn't really matter what else you do.
Well, exactly. And I remember when Trump first became president, one of the first controversies that that involved him was this story about how he said he wasn't interested in getting a daily briefing from the intelligence leaders anymore. They have this thing they call the PDB, the Presidential Daily Briefing, and it's where all these heads of the big bureaus come in and they take an hour plus of the president's time every morning to go over all the super interesting things they found out. And Trump was basically saying, before he even took office, he's like, yeah, you can call me if you've got something interesting. Otherwise, I'm not really interested. That was like completely heretical. And I remember that wasn't even a Trump supporter. At the time, I thought he was, crazy. But I did think that made a lot of sense. I was like, well, why can't he say that? He's the president. That's the whole point. We elect it. You elect a person to make decisions like that. But the notion that the president is not in charge of his own government was something that has been, that has become, the ordinary American has become inculcated with that idea, and we need to reverse that process.
I mentioned at the top that I've listened more than once actually to the speech that you made at Rescue the Republic, and I had a lot of takeaways from it. And I was very taken with your suggestion. I mean, people that know you know that you've been fighting the fight of freedom of speech for as long as I've been aware of you. And you said that in some ways the censorship, the loss of freedom of speech has already happened, and that the larger project is to change the nature of the American.
Right.
Almost to install a new operating system, on their hard drive, and I wondered if you thought that, in fact, that had also been achieved, or if there was still vestigial, at least rebellious, freedom-loving American nature still alive and well.
Well, I'm a little bit more encouraged now than I was then. I was very pessimistic at that time, and I was very worried. And look, there are still huge bureaucracies to deal with, and as I'm sure you're aware, everywhere else in the world, the kind of official censorship movement is already in full swing, and it's about to take some new steps forward in places like Canada. But in the United States, part of the thing that's cool about being an American, and there aren't many things, but there are a few things that are specific, is that we're typically, in any group of people, we're the ones who ask, wait, why? And we tend not to do what we're told. We're a difficult group of people, which is, I think, sometimes a good quality, right? We're not polite, but over the last 8 years or so, there's been this intense effort to try to condition us to a new way of thinking, which is to revere authority. They have this thing called digital literacy that they've been pushing on us, which is basically like you should trust, authoritative sources. That's what Google calls them. They call it surfacing authoritative content. And so they're constantly presenting you with this idea of submission and acceptance and not questioning. Asking questions is itself a form of disinformation, that, according to some of these folks. And that is just so not in our character. We will do something self-harming rather than take a bad order. That's sort of part of our history. And so now I'm a little bit more encouraged, just because that election was such a classic American middle finger move, and it, in a way, a lot of us were just like, whew, all right, it's not completely gone. That's how I interpret it.
It's such a fascinating philosophical area to contemplate. The United States was, well, I don't need to tell you this, but it was founded and built by precisely the sort of people that are now hounded and shut down.
Right.
There's a paradoxical irony about the fact that the founding fathers and the First Amendment and the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, the people that were behind that, are now the sort of people that are absolutely demonized by those who would govern the country.
Right.
And what's really frightening now is that those people that were non-conformists and wanted freedoms of one sort or another, they could run to the United States, they could go to the New World, but now there's no new continent towards which any of us might flee in pursuit of freedom.
Well, right, and that was the whole formula for America's success for a long time was, you got somebody you think is socially unacceptable, we'll take him, we'll set him up, give him a lab out in his barn, whatever, we don't care. And you're right, the people who started the United States, we've forgotten because there's so much other history that's, now considered not positive, but people like Thomas Paine and Patrick Henry, these were not just difficult people, they were sort of violently nonconformist. They thought that anybody who was in the nobility was automatically beneath them. They were very, very sort of, they believed very much in this idea that the ordinary person had his own rights and was every bit as deserving of respect as anybody else, and that was the typical American way of looking at things, and we've really gotten away from that. I mean, it was consistently part of our character, no matter which party you came from. That was something that always appealed to people in this country. Harry Truman saying the buck stops here, right? Like there was this little note of defiance that you could always find. But now, in the last 8 years, there's been this whole concept of the individual isn't really that important. And this was very explicit during the end of the Biden term when they said it's not really important who's actually the president or who Kamala Harris is actually, because you're electing an administration, you're electing a group, and you don't really need to know who the group is. You just need to know what the policies are. But that's not who we are. We're an individualistic country. We celebrate the individual here, and you're right. It's been very strange to watch.
It's beyond strange to watch. How on earth does one get to the point where John Kerry sits in front of an audience at Davos and actually says plainly that the First Amendment is an obstacle to government?
Yeah,
it's through the looking glass.
Yeah, one of the quotes that was so amazing is we need to be able to we need to win the right to govern, right? And the First Amendment was an obstacle to that. Like, you can imagine an American saying that in, I don't know, 1992 or 1971 or something. It would have been, almost grounds for kicking the person out of the country. Of course, we wouldn't do that, but the notion that there is a group of people who think that there is a sort of ruling group that knows what it's doing, they're competent, and everybody else is just sort of dangerous and doesn't have the wisdom to run the country. This is totally out of step with how we understand things traditionally. And for Kerry to do that and to say it on camera also in the middle of an election season was just astounding. But there are a lot of quotes like that. If you go and look, you'll find that that's been said quite a lot, and it's amazing.
He even in his day, he's been around a long time, and in his day he spoke out against the Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. And that kind of action in the future that he is calling for would see young John Kerry thrown in chains into the darkest jail. It's not just happened in the context of the American society. It's happened to that one person, who's gone from taking advantage of the freedom to speak and to protest and to hold the government's feet to the fire to actually wanting to make it impossible for anybody else to do that now.
Right, yeah, that's what's so weird about it, is that he lived the reason that we have a First Amendment, right? The whole conception that the kind of founding fathers, I hate that term, but that's what we use. The whole idea is governments make mistakes. They eventually become insulated. The process of running a country cuts them off from what's really going on in the population, and you need the First Amendment to keep them honest, to prevent them from monopolizing information and trying to impose a false truth. And that the only protection against that is to allow everyone to say whatever they want. And Kerry was a prime example of that. He goes to Vietnam. He's an officer. He clearly believes in the war effort when he goes, because he volunteers for it, right? I mean, he was set to be one of the leaders, and a typical political path for a person like that was to do your service, like John Kennedy, honorably, come back and then run for office. He came back, saw how screwed up Vietnam was, and he drops his medals. He gives them back in this dramatic, gesture, and that is exactly the kind of thing that this new censorship regime, they would have kind of suppressed that image or de-amplified the message that he had brought back. I mean, he was trying to tell them, look, this thing that you're trying to pursue over there, it's just not working, and here's why. In fact, we're the bad guys in the story, and they would have suppressed that. How he doesn't recognize that is beyond me, but
he was in his own time the living embodiment of an obstacle to government.
Right, exactly.
He was standing in the way. He was standing in the way. I suppose it's a logical next step here is, to me, something absolutely crystallized with the Hunter Biden pardon, because it seemed to me, and not just there, but that seemed to be a particularly acute example of the people being told something here, specifically about the rule of law. They seem to be being told, well, the rule of law applies when we say it applies, and it applies differently to you than it applies to us. Now just suck it up. But is there any other way? I mean, how else to interpret that move?
Well, look, the thing that looks worst on the internet is hypocrisy, and when you have 9 minutes of people saying the difference between us and Donald Trump is that Joe Biden would never pardon his son or his friends, right, for political reasons. We respect the justice system, all that, and then of course they lose the election and Hunter Biden is pardoned, and yeah, I would say, okay, whatever. The presidents have pardon power. In other situations, it's a kind of an important civil liberty. It acts as a check against institutional overreach, right? People are jailed often for wrong reasons. But the Hunter Biden story was not really so much about Hunter Biden. It was a window into what looked like maybe a larger corruption investigation, and now they're going to cut it off. And that's just sort of openly admitting to even your own voters that we'll lie when it suits us, or when we say things, you can expect that we're saying them for political reasons. To quote Trump, or one of Trump's spokespeople, they are just words that we are saying, right? They're not. They don't have any value as truth or anything like that. So. Yeah, it's very symptomatic.
I speculate endlessly upon the extent to which the internet was an unintended, or has had a wholly unintended consequence for the powerful. Because I'm prepared to imagine that it was set in place and set in train by those who wanted to create some sort of digital matrix in which to trap everyone. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I do think it's possible that they didn't see that sword would have another edge that would be used against them, and the freedom of information and the sharing of information that has been facilitated by the internet seems to be what is dangerously close to bringing them down. And I do wonder at the extent to which they saw that coming. And go ahead.
Have you interviewed a guy named Martin Gurry?
I haven't. No.
Okay. Well, he's a former CIA analyst. He wrote a book that was published in 2014 called Revolt of the Public, and his premise is exactly what you're talking about. He said basically his job for a living for the agency was to read news and to sort of gather things from open source information and do analyses of it. And his whole point was the internet has made it possible for the ordinary person to see how full of shit like their leaders are. And this is a problem because it's going to make it very difficult to govern in the way that we traditionally have, because we no longer have control over the information sphere. Even before Trump came along, he predicted that the populist movements that you saw in Europe, on both the left and the right? Like, so you have Syriza or, Viktor Orban in Hungary, whatever it is. He predicted that there would be that those kinds of candidates would prevail, and that the sort of typical ruling elites would not know how to answer that problem. And I know from talking to people who worked in the kind of censorship realm, for the Pentagon or for the DoD, that they were very excited about the ability to do things like, helping push the Arab Spring in a certain direction, right? Like that was what they were imagining, was that they would be able to exert further control. But then it just got out of hand in the U.S. and with Brexit and some other things, and they haven't been able to solve that problem. I
was listening to Mike Benz speaking relatively recently, and he was talking about I think it was a freedom of information request or something had come to the end of the period of time under which it was held back from the American people, and it was the National Security Council 10/2, which is this thing that details the necessity for there to be plausible deniability for the government, that empowering the CIA or whatever, but covert agencies to operate without the oversight of the president, so that when asked about it, the president can plausibly deny having known anything about it.
Wow.
And that information's out there. And you've also got attention being drawn to the work of George Kennan, historian and diplomat, who wrote about the psychology of the application of political power. And that these things are out there freely circulating on the internet, and more of us are having our attention drawn to. As you say, it surely becomes impossible for governments to govern in the traditional way, because we can literally see the little man behind the curtain, because the curtain has been pulled aside by the internet.
Absolutely, and I can testify from my own experience in the last couple of years. Just to take an example, when I was working on the Twitter file story about the censorship stuff, we saw that there was that State Department agency, the GEC, that I had never heard of, but that was very involved in all this stuff, this censorship stuff, and the only public information about it was full of redactions. Like, I didn't know who their contractors were. I didn't know where the money was coming from, like how it had been. And so we started sending out freedom of information requests. We sent out hundreds of them over the last couple of years. And we've gotten all kinds, like this gigantic cache of just truly embarrassing stuff about what these organizations and some universities and some other publicly funded entities were trying to do. And all you do is just put that stuff online, and it instantly causes the public to second guess their leaders, because they say, "Oh my God, they're trying to control the way I think. They don't trust me to make decisions with real news and facts and stuff like that." And so, yeah, if they're going to abide by the transparency laws that we passed in the 60s and early 70s, then they're going to have a very hard time governing, unless they're governing in good faith, right? Which I think is an easier solution. But, we'll see.
Do you think trust will be restored? I mean, I find in my own experience, I know, I appreciate and acknowledge that I have become almost unreasonably cynical and skeptical. I'm aware of it. I'm aware of not believing a word I'm told, and I think even a stopped clock tells the right time twice a day. Statistically, some of what I'm being told must be true, but I'm finding it impossible to trust.
Right.
And I wonder how long a road it is back to a point where, and I know I'm not alone, where people begin to believe once again that they're operating within a system that is, well, honest and not just a tissue of deceit.
Well, that's a great question. And, my answer to that is that trust is a very fragile human concept. In journalism, for instance, you gain audience or lose audience based on how much they trust you, and the only way that they trust you is if you behave in a human way toward them, right? I'm going to tell you, I'm going to do my best to tell you the truth, but if I screw up, I'm going to own it. I'll come to you and I'll tell you. And if you don't do that, then your audience loses trust for you. What's happened in the last couple of decades, I think, is that you've had all these people who've come in and believe that there's like a technological hack to political trust, to institutional trust, to journalistic trust, and that could involve anything from manipulating what people see, right? So instead of giving them absolutely free choice to choose their more trusted sources, they will be kind of shown something else first, and also to cut off access to that information that might make them less trustful. But it doesn't work. Ultimately, what ends up happening is that people sense that they're being manipulated, even if they can't see the proof. They know that there's like a human thing. It's sort of like there's a phenomenon where dogs around sociopaths apparently they act funny just because they sense it. I think there's something with human beings where we know when we're being lied to, even when it's not absolutely clear. It's just a sense that we have. We're just put a little bit on guard, and all you have to do to fix that is not do that and just be human. I think very good politicians understand that. Some of them are just very talented liars, but some of them also understand that you have to at some point sometimes be straight with people, and it might hurt in the short run, but it helps in the long run. Once we get back to that, I think we'll be all right. It's just we have to get past this belief that we can hack these things.
Yeah, I mean, George Orwell, amongst much else that sounds like, as if he had the gift of second sight when he was writing 1984, but, he said that journalism is about the only meaningful journalism is telling people things they might think they don't want to know, and that anything else is just advertising.
Right.
And I do wonder at the parlous state of journalism.
Oh.
I mean, we're almost without exception, the silverbacks of the profession just seem to drop their shoulders and walk away from the truth.
Yeah.
At some point in the past, cue the advent of people like yourself and the people that are inhabiting this so-called alternative
heterodox
space.
Is the word, yeah.
Yeah, these people that previously no one had heard, hardly anyone had heard of, no one was paying attention to, but suddenly, almost overnight, they became de facto the trusted sources of information because at least they were saying something that didn't sound like it was coming from as a script from a laminated card somewhere.
Right, exactly, yes.
And I wonder how on earth journalism gets back to where it's... Journalism's so important. It's become something... It's something that was almost a holy calling, and it's been crumpled up and thrown in the bin and replaced by people who just recycle press releases from the government. How on earth, or has it already happened? Are we already just simply inhabiting the alternative journalism space that more and more people will come to?
That's what's happened. And when you talk about how important it is, I think it's basically like a fourth branch of government in the United States, and that was what the conception of the free press was. It was that it was a free-ranging kind of check on everything, and our constituency was the audience, right? So rather than being owing allegiance to institutions, it was understood, I think, from the beginning that the press would naturally sympathize with the people for whom it wrote, right? What's happened in recent years is that the institutional relationships have become more important than audience, and that has corrupted the job and made it useless. I mean, there's nothing more useless than a news network that is just pumping out press releases for the DNC, right? I mean, at the height of this period, at the lowest moments, I guess, height is the wrong word, you could look at the MSNBC news page and the Democrats.org news releases, and you would see almost exactly the same topics discussed in exactly the same way. And yeah, I understand journalists have political opinions and they may sympathize with one party or another, but you always have to keep a certain distance, which is why I'm not good. You won't see me in a group photo with a bunch of people in the Trump administration. I might be currently nicely disposed to some of them, but that's not my job is to not have any friends at all, right? And journalism gets back to being trusted when it does things like break stories that are important to the public, and and be a trusted space again. And it's already doing that. I mean, Joe Rogan's not a journalist, but he's somebody that people trust, not necessarily to tell the truth, but to be who he is, right? To not lie about his intentions, or or to try to manipulate them in some way. He's just an ordinary person who sits there and talks to people, and that they can recognize that genuineness. And there's a reason why he's got 25 times the audience of Anderson Cooper. It's not an accident, you know what I'm saying? So that is already replacing the old thing, and I think that's positive. Throughout our history, we've had great journalism in America, always. It tends to be the people who are in journalism tend to start there and then go on to even bigger and better things, like Mark Twain. So I think this is an exciting time in American journalism, because the old guard is dead, and now there's room to do something new, which is cool.
When you look across the Atlantic, what do you make of? How do you read Britain? How do you read Europe? You've talked about the extent to which censorship has really got its, the jaws of that trap have really snapped shut on the people in Europe and in the UK, but also the rise of the so-called, the seeming pejorative that is populist. The increasing vote in parts of Germany, in France, and elsewhere for populists. Politicians, populist political parties, that's a manifestation of some kind of rebellious spirit.
Sure.
And the incumbent politicians, Macron in France gets voted against and just refuses to stop governing.
Right.
Likewise, Schulz in Germany and so on and so on. They just won't accept defeat.
No.
I wonder how when you look at us with the problems that America has, the cusp of something different that you're on now, you look at Britain, you look at Europe, and what on earth do you think?
Well, Americans are accustomed to thinking of Europe as a little brother, right? Like they're going to do they make great hosts for nature shows, and they're good actors in Marvel movies, and occasionally they invent some cars that we like, but otherwise, we don't really think about them too much. Well, that's changed. Europe is now a major player in the world, because America, in its own role, its old role, is receding, and I think people like Keir Starmer are thinking of themselves as, well, maybe we'll step in and be the new heads of NATO and all these other organizations that traditionally have been dominated by Americans. My first wake-up call about that was when I was working on the Twitter file stuff, and we found a draft report on information disorder that was conducted by a group at the Aspen Institute, which is like this corporate-funded think tank in Colorado, and it was headed by Katie Couric, Prince Harry, and this figure from the Department of Homeland Security. And it's a very long document about how we solve speech problems everywhere. But one of the main pillars of their thinking is that America needs to abandon its attachment to the First Amendment and move towards the European conception of speech, in accordance with the Digital Services Act. And to see all these American journalists and other figures who were on this panel signing off on that was like an incredible shock to me, right? Like, again, this is what has always made us different. We were proud of it, and to just throw it away was incredible. So I think we're moving in that direction, and you see all these leaders that seem like cookie cutter sort of copies of each other. Justin Trudeau, Macron, whatever, they're all interchangeable, it seems to me. But you're right, they're not surrendering. They've been beaten here in the States, but not anywhere else that I can see in an important way. And so, yeah, that's the concern for sure.
I mean, I do want to, as I said, I think optimism is an obligation at the moment, and I do think that I've always said that it's wrong to expect any one person or even one administration, a group of people, to fix everything. That it comes back to the individual in every case. You've got to fight for your own rights. You've got to be aware of what freedom actually means. But I think we are right, regardless of Donald Trump, regardless of the people that he's proposing to appoint. It's what has been awoken in so many people. An incoming administration may satisfy and it may disappoint, but hopefully what the lesson that so many people have learned will be remembered, which is it's up to us to not let this happen. Exactly.
And that's what I was trying to convey at that speech in Washington, which is, yeah, there are big political machinations going on. There are people who are going to be passing laws and doing this and that. But the most important thing is that we stick to our belief and appreciation for freedom, and also to continue to live that spirit, right? Which used to not be hard in America. That's the sort of rock and roll defiance thing that has always been part of us, and by the way, which we also got a lot, from Europe, right? I mean, we were very much in sync with the Europeans after World War II in this whole liberation movement in the modern form. And I just think we need to reanimate some of that and remember the whole concept of defiance. And what they've done in the Trump era is what they've said is, okay, well, we have this dangerous Hitler-like figure over here, which requires the socially conscious, young, rebellious person actually to identify with government in suppressing that bad thing over there. Well, that's kind of a fraudulent come on. Actually, what you should do is you should be suspicious of everybody, including Trump, right? And just be who you are, but don't become a follower. That's what they're trying to do, and as long as we remember that, I think we'll be all right.
Yeah, I think you said towards the end of your speech in Washington, rescuing the Republic, that defy
right.
Authority.
Yeah, exactly.
That is the word for our times, and I very much echo that it's defiance that's the keynote.
Did you have those bumper stickers in the 70s that said "Question Authority"? That was a big thing in the States, right? It was very chic, even among sort of wealthy liberal types. You would have your BMW, but it would have a little "Question Authority" bumper sticker on the back. Yeah, I don't think questioning's enough anymore. I think you got to find a way to say actually no at some point, and that might mean getting involved in politics locally, or quitting a job that's dishonest. And there are tough decisions we're going to have to make in this moment. But I feel better that we're going toward we're going to retain that sort of human instinct than I did before.
Amen to that. Matt Taibbi, it's been a pleasure. I've been looking forward to speaking with you. It has lived up to my expectations. Thank you very much for your time.
No, thank you, Neil. I appreciate it. Let's do it again, and let me know when this is on.
I will do.
Right.
Lovely. Thank you, Matt.
Take care now.